That's the worst part about new fans. You know, they have no perspective. There's no context. So they just say ridiculous nonsense. Like I said earlier, they actually had odds that, you know, she was like third or fourth in the betting odds to be MVP of the WNBA. That's such a slap in the face to every WNBA player.
Revenge doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, changing everything with a single choice, one word that flips the balance of power. And that's exactly what Caitlin Clark did, because for her, revenge wasn't about posting clapbacks on social media or firing off sound bites in interviews. It was about something far more devastating, something that shook the very foundation of women's basketball. She simply said no to Geno Auriemma, no to UConn's so-called untouchable legacy.
A lot of investors in this league, one investor, been trying to keep quiet about, his investment in the league ever since his comments that he made about a young rookie. Pretty much, had him in the headlines for about a month and a half. That is Geno Auriemma, dog. I'm here to tell you, he's part owner of this league.
No to the $1 million lifeline that came crawling back when they realized the empire they built without her was starting to crumble. And that single rejection didn't just deny a paycheck, it humbled the man who never thought he could be humbled. It was a dagger to the old guard and a coronation for Clark's new era. The moment where the entire sport realized this wasn't just about basketball, it was about power, control, and who really owns the future of the game. Before Caitlin Clark became the face of the WNBA, before the sold-out arenas and record-shattering TV ratings, she was just a kid in Iowa with a dream. And like every young girl who grew up obsessed with women's basketball, the mountaintop was always UConn, the dynasty, the empire, the program of Diana Taurasi, Maya Moore, Breanna Stewart, the program that every superstar passed through. And for Caitlin, the path seemed obvious.
The delusional fan base that follows her disrespected the WNBA players by saying she's going to go in that league and tear it apart. There were actually odds on she's third or fourth in betting odds on being MVP of the WNBA. These people are so disrespectful and so unknowledgeable and so stupid that it gives women's basketball a bad name. Okay, so the kid was set up for failure right from the beginning.
The most electrifying talent of her generation, paired with the greatest recruiter the game had ever known, except the call never came. Geno never picked up the phone, never rang her parents, barely even sent a courtesy message through her AAU coach. And that silence wasn't an accident. It was a choice, a statement, a brutal reminder that in his eyes, she wasn't their priority. And when asked why, he brushed it off by saying UConn already had Paige Buchers and he didn't want 2 point guards. But then he twisted the knife further, suggesting that if Clark really wanted UConn, she should have called him. Think about that. The man who built his legacy on spotting once-in-a-generation talent before anyone else acted like Caitlin Clark wasn't worth the effort, and then blamed a teenager for not chasing him. And that wasn't just a recruiting miss, it was disrespect, the kind of arrogance you never forget. So Caitlin Clark did what legends do. She took that disrespect and turned it into fuel. Instead of begging for UConn's spotlight, she chose Iowa, a program without banners, without the dynasty glow, without the mystique, and to outsiders, it looked like a consolation prize. But for Clark, it was liberation, because at Iowa, she wasn't Paige's shadow, she wasn't Geno's afterthought, she was the centerpiece, the one who would carry the entire program. And from the very first time she laced up in Iowa City, she rewrote the script. Those logo threes weren't just shots, they were declarations. Those packed arenas weren't just crowds, they were proof. Those record-shattering TV ratings weren't accidents, they were receipts. Every basket, every viral highlight, every broken record screamed one message back at UConn, and Geno Auriemma, you missed this, you underestimated me, and now you'll have to watch as I build an empire without you. But instead of admitting his mistake, Geno doubled down. Instead of showing humility, he leaned into arrogance. Every time Caitlin's name came up, he brushed her off with smug little sound bites, calling her a kid who plays like she's just shooting in the driveway, as if her generational talent was nothing more than a backyard trick. He tried to shrink her brilliance into something ordinary, but ordinary doesn't sell out Madison Square Garden. Ordinary doesn't drag the WNBA into mainstream relevance. Ordinary doesn't move millions of dollars. And yet, there was Geno clinging to the old playbook of belittlement, convinced that if he minimized her enough, people would believe him. But the problem for him was simple. Clark wasn't ordinary, she was extraordinary, and with every record broken, every headline written, and every highlight that shook the internet, his dismissive words aged worse than milk left in the sun, proving not only that he was wrong, but that he was terrified of what she represented, the end of his era and the beginning of hers. And Geno couldn't stop himself. Whenever Caitlin Clark's name was mentioned, he found a way to drag her back into Paige Bucher's comparisons. If Clark was fearless, Paige was too. If Clark connected with fans, Paige had done it first. It was never random, it was strategy. By tethering Clark's rise to his chosen star, he kept himself in the conversation. He wanted the world to believe her success wasn't unique, that it was just another chapter in the UConn dynasty he created. But those backhanded compliments didn't fool anyone. Fans noticed, analysts noticed, even other coaches noticed. They saw through the act. They saw that Clark's brilliance stood on its own, bigger crowds than pro teams, ratings the sport had never seen, conversations about women's basketball exploding worldwide. And all the while, Geno smiled for the cameras while his insecurities showed through. Because behind that charm was a man watching the spotlight move away from him, and no matter how many slide digs he threw, it became clear Caitlin Clark didn't need him, but he desperately needed her just to stay relevant. Eventually, the mask slipped. The slide digs weren't enough anymore. Geno moved from throwing shade to outright attacking the very people who supported Caitlin Clark. For months, he hid behind commentary, pretending it was analysis. But then, in June 2024, on The Dan Patrick Show, he crossed a line he could never step back from. The Hall of Fame coach, who once ruled women's basketball, didn't just question Caitlin. He went after her fans. He called them delusional, said they were clueless about the game, even accused them of disrespecting veteran WNBA players by believing Clark could dominate. He mocked the betting odds that had her in the top 4 for MVP as a rookie, saying those predictions were so stupid they gave women's basketball a bad name. And in that moment, it wasn't about strategy or coaching anymore, it was personal. Because by insulting the millions of families, kids, and casual fans who had just flooded into the sport thanks to Caitlin Clark, he wasn't just tearing her down, he was tearing down the lifeblood of the entire movement she had created. But here's the twist that makes this story unforgettable. Because everything Geno mocked, every prediction he laughed at, every insult he threw at her fans, ended up backfiring in the most brutal way possible. Caitlin Clark didn't clap back on social media. She didn't cut angry interviews. She didn't need to. Her response came on the only stage that mattered, the court. And what followed wasn't just vindication, it was a demolition of his credibility. Clark went out and won Rookie of the Year. She made all WNBA first team. And when the MVP votes came in, she finished exactly 4th, right where those supposedly delusional fans predicted she would. The very thing Geno said was stupid became reality. And in that moment, it wasn't just Clark who was validated, it was every parent who bought tickets, every kid who wore her jersey, every new fan who tuned into women's basketball for the first time. They were all proven right. And Geno was exposed as the one out of touch. His words didn't just age badly, they collapsed into some of the worst takes in sports history. By the end of her rookie season, the conversation wasn't about whether Caitlin Clark lived up to the hype. It was about how completely she obliterated every single doubt. Geno's insults didn't just miss the mark, they aged like milk left out in the summer sun, bitter, embarrassing, and impossible to defend. Yet, instead of admitting defeat, he couldn't let go. Being wrong wasn't something he could stomach, and what really burned him wasn't just her talent, it was what she represented, the changing of the guard, the undeniable truth that women's basketball no longer revolved around him. So he kept talking, interview after interview, podcast after podcast, her name never far from his lips, a little praise wrapped in a jab, a compliment covered with a dig, but the more he spoke, the clearer it became. Caitlin Clark wasn't just rewriting the record books, she was living rent-free in Geno Auriemma's head. Her success wasn't something he could control, it was something he was forced to watch, powerless, as the game shifted in front of his eyes. At some point, words stopped being enough, and Geno made one last desperate move. If he couldn't control the narrative with his mouth, maybe he could do it with money. That's how the $1 million offer came into play. Because behind the shiny launch of the new 3-on-3 League Unrivaled, backed by stars like Breanna Stewart and Nafisa Collier, there was Geno pulling strings. And for all the investors and hype, they had one problem. They didn't have the one player who could give the project instant credibility. And that player was Caitlin Clark. So the same coach who once ignored her recruitment, who dismissed her as driveway talent, who mocked her fans as delusional, came back with a contract so massive, it would have been one of the richest deals in women's basketball history, $1 million for just 8 weeks. And yet, when that paper slid across her desk, she didn't flinch. She didn't beg for the spotlight. She didn't need validation. She simply said no. And in that single rejection, she didn't just humble a man who built his reputation on control. She showed the world that she wasn't just rejecting a league, she was rejecting his entire system, his arrogance, his power, and in that moment, the throne he thought he owned burned to ashes. So in the end, this wasn't just a story about basketball, it was a story about power, about control, about who really owns the future of the game. Because Geno Auriemma's biggest mistake wasn't ignoring Caitlin Clark as a recruit. His biggest mistake was believing the sport couldn't grow without him. He thought he was indispensable. She proved he was irrelevant, and when she turned down that $1 million offer with one quiet no, she didn't just reject a contract. She rejected his system, his authority, his entire worldview, and in doing so, she didn't just win, she changed the game. For decades, the old guard decided who mattered and who didn't. But Clark shattered that model and showed an entire generation of athletes they don't need permission or validation from gatekeepers. They've got the fans, the star power, and the platform to build their own empires. That's why her story is more than revenge. It's a revolution. And maybe the old saying is wrong. Maybe revenge isn't best served cold. Maybe the sweetest revenge is served silently with one word, one decision, one rejection that humbles your enemy and shifts the future forever. Caitlin Clark didn't just dethrone Geno Auriemma, she proved the throne itself was gone, and now the game belongs to her and the new era she represents.